My name is Elias Brandt, and I was born and raised in a small Anabaptist community in the mountains of Montana. My life was always surrounded by strict rules and a simple routine. No electricity, no cars, no contact with the outside world beyond what was necessary. From a young age, I was taught that strict obedience to traditions was the only way to please God. I dressed just as my ancestors did, worked alongside my family in the fields, and followed religious rituals with devotion. But even while doing everything right, something inside me felt empty. I prayed every night, yet many times my words seemed to vanish into the ceiling. Did God really hear me? Was I on the right path, or merely following the steps imposed upon me? These doubts haunted me, but I suppressed them, knowing that questioning was seen as dangerous. Everything changed one cold late afternoon. I was returning home in the family carriage, the biting wind blowing against my face as the wheels creaked on the dirt road. The sun was already beginning to disappear behind the hills when suddenly a truck appeared from a narrow curve, coming too fast to stop in time. I didn't even have time to scream. The impact was brutal. The sound of the crash was deafening, and then everything went dark. I felt no pain, not immediately. When I opened my eyes, I realized that I was no longer on the road, nor inside the carriage. I was in a completely different place, a deep, dense void, as if darkness itself had weight. The air seemed heavy, suffocating. There was no ground beneath my feet, no walls around me, only a black infinite abyss. I tried to speak, but my voice was swallowed by the absolute silence. Fear took hold of me. Where was I? Was this death? I had always believed that if I lived by the rules, I would witness God's glory when my time came. But there, in that dark and cold place, all I felt was the weight of something unknown. As I floated in that suffocating darkness, images began to appear before me. At first, they were familiar scenes. I saw my childhood, days working in the fields, moments of prayer with my family. Everything seemed correct, pure. But then, something changed. The images began to show the moments I had avoided remembering. I saw my own arrogance when I judged those who did not follow the rules as rigidly as I did. I saw the coldness with which I ignored a friend's questioning, someone who wrestled with the very doubts I feared to admit. My heart tightened as I realized how my faith, based on blind obedience, had made me insensitive to the suffering of others. Then, the worst happened. I saw the consequences of my actions. The harsh words that hurt, the looks of disapproval that drove away those who most needed support. My pride in following the rules had blinded me to the true purpose of faith. With each scene, the weight of guilt became unbearable. The darkness around me seemed to grow as if it were feeding on my remorse. For the first time, I understood just how lost I was. I had followed every rule to the letter, but did I truly know God? The darkness around me seemed to come alive, closing in on me as if it wanted to swallow me whole. The weight of loneliness was crushing, and a growing despair took over. I had always believed that living according to the community's rules was the path to God, but there, in that endless void, I felt more distant from Him than ever. My mind screamed for answers. Where was God's presence? Why did I not feel His peace? The silence was absolute, and fear turned into terror. Then, without warning, I began to see my life flash before my eyes. At first, these were moments I had always considered good. My prayers, my dedication to work, my obedience to the community's rules. But something was wrong. There was no life in those moments, only empty rituals. Then came the scenes I did not want to see. The moments when I silently doubted, when I followed the rules out of fear and not out of love, when I judged others for not being as rigid as I was. I saw the effect of these attitudes, people pushed away, wounded hearts, opportunities to show compassion wasted. And then The worst thought struck me like a blow. I had spent my entire life following traditions, yet I had never truly known God. The void around me seemed to become even denser, as if it were pulling me into it. I tried to move, but there was no ground, no direction, only that all-encompassing, suffocating darkness enveloping me completely. Fear turned into despair. My whole life, I had followed the rules, done everything the way I was taught, and yet I was here. There was no light, no peace, only an overwhelming silence that seemed to weigh upon my soul. I tried to cry out to God, but my voice was barely more than a whisper swallowed by the void. It was then that I began to see, almost as if I were watching from the outside, my own life pass before my eyes. I saw myself in the midnight prayers, in the long hours working in the fields, in the silent gatherings of the community. For a moment, everything seemed right, but soon the moments began to change. I saw my own coldness when someone in the community struggled with doubts, and I simply looked away. I saw pride in following the rules take the place of true faith. And worse, I saw how my rigid belief led me to judge and push away those who needed love and grace. It was as if, for the first time, I was seeing my soul for what it truly was, and I did not like what I saw. The weight of truth crushed me. I had always thought I was on the right path, that my obedience to the rules was enough to secure my salvation. But now, seeing my life from the outside, I understood how mistaken I was. My heart had never truly been surrendered to God. I was merely following orders, trying to convince myself that it was enough. Guilt spread within me like a cold fire, and the darkness around me seemed to feed on that feeling, growing even denser, more suffocating. I fell to my knees, not knowing what to do. For the first time, I admitted to myself that I was lost. Everything I had believed in now seemed empty. My faith was based on fear, not on love. My pride had made me blind. And then, in the midst of that despair, I did something I had never done before. I set aside the rules, the traditions, everything I had been taught, and simply cried out, "God, if you are truly listening, please help me." My voice echoed in the void, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then, something changed. At first, it was just a distant point, almost imperceptible. A small, flickering light in the midst of that overwhelming darkness. I barely had time to process what was happening before I realized that the light was growing, stronger and closer with every moment. The darkness around me seemed to retreat, as if unable to withstand that presence. For the first time since the accident, I felt something different from fear and despair. I felt hope. The light continued to expand until I could finally see its source. Before me, enveloped in an indescribable glow, was someone I had never seen before, yet somehow I recognized. His eyes met mine, and in that instant everything inside me seemed to calm. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a love so pure and profound that it tightened my heart. I knew exactly who he was, without the need for words. He took a step forward, and the light around him shone even brighter. I felt an overwhelming urge to fall to the ground and hide my face, not out of fear, but because before him I felt completely exposed. He saw everything. Every mistake, every doubt, every moment when I had followed the rules out of obligation and not out of love. And yet there was no condemnation in his look, only compassion. "Elias," he said, his voice firm yet gentle, "why did you trust so much in the works of your hands and never in my love?" His words hit me like a blow to the chest. I wanted to answer, to justify my choices, to say that I had merely followed what I was taught, but I knew it was no use. Deep down, I had always harbored doubts. I had always felt that something was missing. I had just never had the courage to admit it. The words caught in my throat. For the first time, I clearly saw what was wrong. I had spent my life trying to earn something that could never be achieved by human effort. I tried to justify my existence by following rules, believing that it would make me worthy of God's love. But there, before him, I understood the truth. I could never be good enough on my own. And I didn't have to be. Tears filled my eyes. I didn't know, I whispered, my voice failing. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought that was what the Lord wanted from me. He knelt before me, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch was not merely physical. It was as if every burden I had carried began to vanish. I have always been here, he said, waiting for you to look to me and not to the rules. The light around him seemed to pulse with life, and in that moment, something inside me began to transform. The weight of guilt, fear, and insecurity that I had carried for years was dissolving. I had never felt anything like it before, a peace so deep it was almost unbelievable. Then he spoke again, his voice filled with love and authority. The rules could never save you, Elias. They were only a way to point you to me. But you placed your faith in them, instead of placing it in me. His gaze pierced my soul, and I knew he was right. I had followed orders, but had never truly trusted him. My attempts to be perfect were nothing more than a shield to hide the fact that I did not really know God. The weight of that revelation made me crumble. I fell to my knees, tears streaming freely down my face. For the first time, I did not try to justify myself, nor did I try to argue. I simply allowed the truth to fill me. I was wrong, I whispered, my voice trembling. I lived my entire life trying to follow rules, but I never truly knew you. I thought I was close to God, but now I see how far I was. He came even closer, his presence radiating a peace I had never felt before. Elias, he said tenderly, I never asked for perfection. I only wanted your heart. His words washed over me like a wave, erasing all the guilt and fear that had tormented me for so long. It was so simple, so obvious, yet I'd never seen it before. All he wanted was for me to trust him, to accept his love without trying to earn it. The light around him seemed to grow as I embraced that truth. For the first time in my life, I understood what grace meant. It wasn't something I could earn, nor a reward for my efforts. It was a gift freely offered with no requirements beyond accepting it. I felt the weight of years of futile effort dissolve. I no longer needed to prove anything. Then he extended his hand toward me. Come, Elias. You no longer need to carry that burden. Trembling but without hesitation, I took his hand. In that very moment, a wave of warmth ran through my body, as if all the invisible chains that had imprisoned me were breaking. For the first time, I felt truly free, not because I had followed all the rules, but because I finally knew him. The light around him shone even more brilliantly, enveloping everything in an indescribable warmth. I felt something shift inside me, as if a door had been opened, allowing me to see the world in a way I never had before. I was no longer bound by fear, guilt, or the need to prove my worth. For the first time, I understood the true meaning of faith. It was not about rules, but about relationship. Then he spoke again, his voice filled with a peace that seemed to touch every part of my being. Now that you know the truth, Elias, go and share it. There are many who, like you, are trapped by the weight of religion without ever having experienced God's love. Show them that it is not the rules that save, but grace. In that moment, I knew that my life would never be the same again. I had been given a second chance, not only to live, but to live differently, with a greater purpose than I had ever imagined. The light around me began to fade slowly, and I felt myself being pulled back. There was no fear, only the certainty that my journey was just beginning. The last thing I heard was his soft yet authoritative voice. I will be with you always. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything disappeared. I opened my eyes with difficulty and realized that I was lying on the ground, surrounded by paramedics. Pain coursed through my body, but it did not compare to the transformation that was taking place inside me. I was no longer the same man who had entered that void. I knew that God had given me a new chance, not just to live, but to live in a completely different way. The days that followed were a mix of physical recovery and deep reflection. As my body healed from the accident, my soul was reborn. I knew I could not continue living the same way. Something within me had changed forever. But how could I explain this to my family, to the community? How could I tell them that everything we had been taught about faith and salvation was not exactly as we had believed? When I finally returned home, I sat down with my family to share my experience. The words came out hesitantly at first, but soon they flowed like a dam breaking. I told them about the darkness, about the weight of my life based solely on rules, and about the moment I found the light, when I finally understood what it meant to truly know God. Silence filled the room. Some seemed moved by what I said, while others looked on with suspicion. My father was the first to speak. "Elias, what you are saying goes against everything we believe." I knew that reaction was coming, but still, hearing my father say that made my heart ache. I took a deep breath before answering. "Father, I am not rejecting everything we were taught. I only saw something I had never understood before. It is not the rules that save us, but God's grace. I spent my entire life trying to be perfect, but I never felt peace until the moment I found Him." My mother silently wiped away a tear, while my siblings simply watched, unsure of how to react. My father, however, kept a stern face. "If you begin to question what we have followed for generations, where will that lead you? Without order, without the rules, what remains?" I knew he feared I would completely turn away from our community, but that was not my desire. I wanted everyone to understand what I now knew, that obedience was valuable, but without a genuine relationship with God, it was merely an empty burden. The following days were difficult. My family avoided discussing the matter, as if ignoring it could make my experience vanish, but I knew I could not remain silent. Gradually, I began to share my story with others in the community. Some listened out of curiosity, others with skepticism. But there were those who, like me, carried silent doubts. One of them was Josias, a young man who always seemed restless during services. One day, he approached me after a meeting and, glancing around to ensure no one was listening, asked, "Elias, is it true what they say, that you saw something different?" I nodded and began to recount everything that had happened. He listened silently, his eyes filled with something I recognized, hope mixed with fear. "I've always wondered if there was more than this," he admitted, almost whispering. In that moment, I realized that my mission was only just beginning. As days passed, more people began to seek me out in secret. Some came merely out of curiosity, but others carried in their gaze the same weight I had felt for so many years, the fear that, despite all their obedience, something was still missing. Gradually, small meetings began to take place. We gathered in barns, in the fields, or even during our morning walks, away from the watchful eyes of the community leaders. But not everyone was open to what I had to say. The elders began to notice that something was changing. Whispers spread throughout the village. Some accused me of being misled, of bringing confusion into our traditions. I was summoned before the church leaders, who looked at me with disapproval. "Elias," one of them began, his voice laden with authority, "you are straying. The faith of our ancestors has guided us for generations. Why do you insist on questioning what has always been right?" I took a deep breath before replying. I knew that moment would determine the course of my life within the community. "I am not questioning out of rebellion," I said firmly, yet without aggression. "I only saw something I had never understood before. True faith is not found solely in rules, but in a relationship with God. I followed every tradition to the letter for years, but I never felt peace until the moment He showed me the truth. The elders exchanged looks, some with closed expressions, others appearing uneasy. "Elias," one of them said in a softer tone, "we follow these rules because we believe that this is the right path. Without them, what remains?" I looked at them and felt a weight in my chest. I knew that many there carried the same fear I had once felt, yet were trapped by tradition, unable to see beyond it. "What remains," I answered, "is God. He does not love us because of our rules, but because He is love, and He wants us to know Him truly, not just follow orders without understanding why." The ensuing silence was heavy. I could sense the conflict in some of their eyes, while others maintained their stern expressions, refusing to consider my words. One of the elders leaned forward, fingers intertwined. "Elias, you are treading a dangerous path. We have seen others question, and we know how it ends. If you continue like this, you may be expelled from the community. Are you willing to bear that burden?" The question struck me forcefully. I knew what it meant. If I were banished, I would lose everything, my family, my home, the life I had known since birth. But at the same time, I could no longer turn back. After all I had experienced, after all I now knew, how could I ignore the truth? I looked at them and, with a lump in my throat, replied, "If this is the price for following what God has shown me, then I accept it, because now I know He is greater than any tradition." My words hung in the air like an invisible weight. Some of the elders lowered their heads, others looked at me in disbelief. I knew that in that moment, my life within the community would never be the same. The eldest among them sighed deeply before saying, "If this is the path you have chosen, then you must be aware of the consequences. You cannot continue here, spreading ideas that go against the teachings we have followed for generations." I had expected this, yet hearing the final sentence still made my heart ache. My family, my home, everything I had known was being taken away from me, but at the same time I felt an inexplicable peace. I was not alone. He was with me, and that was enough. I slowly stood up and faced each of them. "I did not come here to divide, but to share what I have seen," I said calmly, "and I know that sooner or later others will see it too." With nothing more to say, I turned and left, knowing that it was the end of one chapter, but only the beginning of something much greater. The days that followed were the hardest of my life. As expected, I was officially banished from the community. My family was forbidden from keeping in touch with me, and in their eyes, I was no longer part of that world. I left my home with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few belongings. Not knowing where to go, I walked to the nearest town, feeling the weight of the unknown ahead. Yet, even amid uncertainty, one thing remained unshaken. I was free. For the first time, I was not burdened by the obligation to prove my worth through rules. I did not know exactly what I would do next, but I was certain that God would guide me. And then, as if confirming that certainty, I found an open door. A small church in town welcomed my story, and for the first time, I met people who understood what I had been through. I was no longer alone. The church community embraced me with open arms, something I had never experienced before. They did not judge me for my past, nor did they ask if I was following all the right rules. They simply listened. For the first time, I spoke about my experience without fear, without the worry of being condemned for my words, and to my surprise, many there understood exactly what I felt, the weight of a faith based solely on duty, without a real relationship with God. Over time, I began to rebuild myself. I got a simple job in town and gradually started reconstructing my life outside the community where I was raised. But despite everything I had lost, I felt no bitterness. On the contrary, my heart burned with a new purpose. I knew that many in my old community still lived as I once did, trapped by fear, guilt, and without knowing the true freedom of grace. And I could not ignore that. That was when I understood my mission. I could not simply move on and forget those still trapped in the same cycle of fear and obligation. I needed to go back, not physically, for I knew I would not be accepted, but in some way, my story needed to reach them. I began writing letters to a few trusted friends within the community, recounting my experience and what I had learned. At first, no one replied. But then, weeks later, I received my first response. It was from Josias, the young man who had secretly approached me before. His words were hesitant, yet filled with something I knew well, doubt mixed with hope. "Elias, your words won't leave my mind. I never questioned the ordnung before, but now I realize I've been carrying a weight I can't explain. How can I know if what you say is true?" That letter was the sign I needed. Even though I had been banished, my voice could still reach those seeking the truth. Josias's letter rekindled something within me. I knew he wasn't the only one feeling that burden, and if at least one person was beginning to see, it was worth continuing. I replied to him immediately, sharing more about my journey, about the love of God I had found, and how I no longer needed to live, trying to earn something that had already been freely given. In time, other letters began to arrive. Some were discreet, written carefully so as not to raise suspicions, but all carried the same sentiment, doubts that had once been repressed now coming to the surface. Some people wanted to understand better, others were afraid to question, and some even reported that they were beginning to see faith in a different light. My heart filled with hope. Even if I couldn't be there physically, the truth was beginning to spread. Even from a distance, I felt that something was changing. Some of the people who had once rejected me were now beginning to listen. I knew I wouldn't convince everyone, and that many would never accept my story, but that did not matter. If even one life were transformed, it would be worth it. Looking back, I see how God used everything that happened to show me the truth. I was no longer a man bound by fear and obligation. I was free, not because I had followed all the rules, but because I finally understood that God's grace is not something to be earned, but accepted. My journey is not over. I continue sharing my story whenever I have the opportunity, because I know there are still many who need to hear it. And even in moments of doubt or loneliness, I remember the promise I heard that day: I will be with you always. Today, I wake up every day with a renewed purpose. No matter where I am or with whom I speak, my mission remains the same: to share the truth that changed my life. The fear and insecurity that once dominated me have been replaced by a peace that nothing can take away. I know my journey will not be easy, and that there will always be those who reject what I have to say, but that does not discourage me. If there is one thing I have learned, it is that God is not bound by rules or traditions. He is alive, calling each of us to know Him truly. The freedom I found did not come from what I did, but from what He did for me. And now, all I wish is that others also find that freedom. Because truth is not a burden, not a weight to be carried. It is the grace that sets us free. And if you want to continue discovering more about these hidden truths and revelations that many try to conceal, subscribe to the channel right now. Every day we bring new stories, impactful testimonies, and profound reflections on what truly lies beyond this life. Activate the bell so you don't miss anything, and share this message with those who need to hear it. See you in the next video.